The Polish Hussars, or Polish Husaria, xu๊sari.a, or Winged Hussars, were one of the main types of the cavalry in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between the 16th and 18th centuries, modelled on the Hungarian Hussars. The early Hussars were light cavalry of exiled Serbian warriors. By the second half of the 16th century and after Stephen Báthory's reforms, Hussars transformed into a heavily armoured shock cavalry. Until the reforms of the 1770s, the Husaria banners were considered the elite of the Polish cavalry. History. Hussars originated in mercenary units of exiled Serbian warriors. Serbian lances, also called rakowie, were used to counter Ottoman Sipahi and Delhi cavalry. The oldest mention of Hussars in Polish documents date to 1500, although they were probably in service earlier. In the 15th century, light Hussars based on those of Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus were adopted by some European armies to provide light, expendable cavalry units. The Polish Hussars were originally based on the Hungarian Hussars. The development of light cavalry in the Polish army in the 16th century was partly modelled after the Serbian light cavalry that appeared in Corvinus's army. Initially, the first Hussar units in the Kingdom of Poland were formed by the same Polish parliament in 1503, which hired 3 banners of Hungarian mercenaries. Soon, recruitment also began among Polish citizens, being far more expendable than the heavily armoured lances of the Renaissance. The Serbian-Hungarian Hussars played a fairly minor role in the Polish crown victories during the early 16th century, exemplified by the victories at Orsa, 1514, and Oberton, 1531. During the so-called transition period of the mid-16th century, heavy Hussars largely replaced armoured lances riding armoured horses. In the Polish Obrona Potoczna cavalry forces serving on the southern frontier, the true Winged Hussar arrived with the reforms of the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Stephen Báthory, in the 1570s, and was later led by the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, John III Sobieski. The Hussars were the leading, or even elite, branch of cavalry in the Polish army from the 1570s until 1776, when their duties and traditions were passed on to the Uhlans by a parliamentary decree. Most Hussars were recruited from the wealthier Polish nobility, szlachta. Each Hussar Taurus comrade raised his own poksy, a lance, retinue. Several retinues were combined to form a Hussar banner company, Kuradzi of Husarska. Over the course of the 16th century, Hussars in Hungary became heavier in character. They abandoned wooden shields and adopted metal-plated body armor. When Báthory was elected King of Poland and later accepted as a Grand Duke of Lithuania in 1576, he reorganized the Hussars of his royal guard into a heavy formation equipped with a long lance as their main weapon. By the reign of Báthory, 1576 to 1586, the Hussars had replaced medieval-style lances in the Polish Crown Army, and they now formed the bulk of the Polish cavalry. By the 1590s, most Polish Hussar units had been reformed along the same, heavy, model. These heavy Hussars were known in Poland as Husaria. With the Battle of Lubuszew in 1577, the Golden Age of the Husaria began. Between then and the Battle of Vienna in 1683, the Hussars fought many battles against various enemies, most of which they won. In the battles of Lubuszew in 1577, Byczyna, 1588, Kochenhausen, 1601, Kiekum, 1605, Klushin, 1610, Chocim, 1621, Martinau, 1624, Trzciana, 1629, Okhmatau, 1644, Berestechko, 1651, Polonka, 1660, Kudnow, 1660, Chokim, 1673, Lwow, 1675, Vienna, 1683, and Parkany, 1683. They proved to be the decisive factor against often overwhelming odds. For instance, in the Battle of Klushin during the Polish-Muscovite War, the Russians outnumbered the Commonwealth army 5-1, yet were heavily defeated. The role of the Hussar evolved into a reconnaissance and advanced scout capacity. Their uniforms became more elaborate as their armor and heavy weapons were abandoned. In the 18th century, as infantry firearms became more effective, heavy cavalry, with its tactics of charging into and breaking infantry units, became increasingly obsolete, and hussars transformed from an elite fighting unit to a parade one. Instead of ostrich feathers, the Husaria men wore wooden arcs attached to their armor at the back and raising over their heads. These arcs, together with bristling feathers sticking out of them, were dyed in various colors in imitation of laurel branches or palm leaves, and were a strangely beautiful sight to behold. Jedrzej Kitovich, 1728–1804. The Hussars were famous for their huge wings, a wooden frame carrying eagle, ostrich, swan or goose feathers. In the 16th century, characteristic painted wings or winged claws began to appear on cavalry shields. The most common theory is that the Hussars wore the wings because they made a loud, clattering noise which made it seem like the cavalry was much larger than in reality and frightened the enemy's horses. Other possibilities included the wings being made to defend the backs of the men against swords and lassos, or that they were worn to make their own horses deaf to the wooden noisemakers used by the Ottoman and the Crimean Tatars. Tactics. The Hussars represented the heavy cavalry of the Commonwealth. The Taurus Husarski, companion, commanded his own polk kopia, consisting of 2 to 5 similarly armed retainers and other servants, chelodnici, who tended to his horses, food, supplies, repairs and fodder, and often participated in battle. His lance was part of a larger unit known as a banner. Kuragiev. Each banner had from 30 to over 60 kopia. The commander, for his contractual obligation, was called rotmistras, while the de facto commander was often the poruchnik, lieutenant. There was also one korazi, ensign, who carried the banner's flag, znak, or Kuragiev, and could command the banner when the poruchnik was unable to. Each banner had one rotmistras kopia that was larger than its other lances. This included trumpeters and musicians, kettle drummers, more trumpeters, etc. There were other Tauriso with duties, keeping order, helping with maneuvers within the banner during battle, but their functions are rather poorly understood. The Polish Hussars' primary battle tactic was the charge. They charged at and through the enemy. The charge started at a slow pace and in a relatively loose formation. The formation gradually gathered pace and closed ranks while approaching the enemy, and reached its highest pace and closest formation immediately before engagement. They tended to repeat the charge several times until the enemy formation broke. They had supply wagons with spare lances. The tactic of a charge by heavily armored hussars and horses was usually decisive for nearly 2 centuries. The hussars fought with a long lance, a konchets, stabbing sword, a zabla, saber, set of 2 to 6 pistols, often a carbine or arquebus, known in Polish as a bandolej, and sometimes a warhammer, a light axe. The lighter, Ottoman-style saddle allowed for more armor to be used by both the horses and the warriors. Moreover, The horses were bred to run very fast with a heavy load and to recover quickly. These were hybrids of old Polish equine lineage and Eastern horses, usually from Tatar tribes. As a result, a horse could walk hundreds of kilometers loaded with over 100 kilograms warrior plus armor and weaponry, and instantly charge. Also, Hussar horses were very quick and maneuverable. This made Hussars able to fight with any cavalry or infantry force from Western heavy cuirassiers to quick Tatars. There was a death penalty for selling a Husaria horse. Sometimes the horses were referred to as tarpan to someone outside of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Armor and weaponry. The Hussars tourists were required to provide the arms and armor for themselves and their retainers, except for the lance which was provided by the king. Each lance's horses also came at each tourist hussar's expense. During their heyday, 1574 to 1705, Winged Hussars carried the following arms and armor. The kopia lance was the main offensive weapon of the hussar. The lances were based on the Balkan and, finally, Hungarian lances, but Polish lances could have been longer and, like their predecessors from the Balkans and Western Europe, they were hollowed, with two halves glued together and painted, and were often richly gilded. They were commonly made from fir wood, with the lance point being made from forged steel. They had a galka, a large wooden ball which served as the handle guard. The Hussars' lances usually ranged from 4.5 to 6.2 meters in length and were provided by the king at the Barnazona, not by the regular soldiers. A large, silk, taffeta proporzic pennon was attached to the lance below the point. Another type of lance, known as the demi-lance kopijaka, was used and could have been 3 to 3.6 meters long and was used against the Tatars and Turks. In late 17th century wars, the Taurus Hussarski carried underneath his left thigh an Eastern-derived konchertse stock, up to 1.5 meters in length, and, often, a palash, a type of broadsword, under his right thigh. The zabla saber was carried on the left side, and several types of sabers were known to Winged Hussars, including the famous sabla husarska. Winged Hussars sometimes carried additional weapons, such as nadziak, type of war hammers and battle axes. Taurus Hussarski carried one or two wheel-lock, later flintlock, pistols in the saddle holsters, while retainers also might have carried a pistol, a light wheel-lock arquebus, a carbine. From the 1680s a carbine for retainers was mandatory. Individual Hussar tourists may possibly have carried a Tatar, a Turkish reflex bow with arrows in a quiver, especially after the mid-17th century, when many panzerny companions became Hussars, and some sources of the late 17th century note the existence of bows amongst the Hussar companions. During the first half of the 18th century, while in non-military attire, the Hussar's companion carried a bow in a bow case to denote his military status. Yet bows in bow cases were carried by all cavalry officers of the National Army until the reforms of the 1770s, including Uhlan units in the Saxon service. At the height of their prowess, from 1576 to 1653, Hussar armor consisted of a Polish variant of the Sisak Oriental Turkic-originated helmet with a hemispherical skull, comb-like, Western morion cheekpieces, with a heart-shaped cut in the middle, neck guard of several plates secured by sliding rivets, and adjustable nasal terminating in a leaf-shaped visor. Sisak and kettle hat helmets for the lower rank. Retainers were often blackened, as was their armor. A cuirass, breastplate, backplate, gorget, shoulder guards, and of the great steppe, Western vambraces with iron glove, and later, during the 1630s, The Persian-originated car wash vambrace for forearm protection. Tourists also could wear tacit hip, creased thigh and pull-in knee protection underneath a thigh-length coat of mail, especially padded coat with mail sleeves. Retainers usually wore less expensive and older armor, often painted black, and, after the 1670s, might have no cuirass. According to some sources, Karasinus armation armor, of iron scales riveted to a leather support, might have consisted of a scale helmet, cuirass, gorget, leg and shoulder protection, and became popular during the reign of King John Sobieski. But perhaps due to costs and weight, remained popular mostly with the Winged Hussar commanding officers. Their armor was light, usually around 15 kilograms, allowing them to be relatively quick and for their horses to gallop at full speed for long periods, albeit from the 1670s onwards. Chain mail was used when fighting the Tatars in the southern part of the Republic. Tourists usually wore a leopard, sometimes tiger, jaguar or lion, pelt over his left shoulder, or as often depicted in the surviving Podhorst castle paintings, he had the exotic pelt underneath his saddle or wrapped around his hips. Wolf, brown bear and lynx pelts were reserved for leaders and veterans. Starsizna, legacy. The Polish Hussars are depicted on the commemorative 200 zloty gold coin. The badge of the Polish Army's 1st Armored Division is inspired by the armor of the Winged Hussars. Swedish power metal band Sabaton, on their 2016 album The Last Stand, wrote a song in honor of the Polish Hussars entitled Winged Hussars, about the role of the Hussars in the Battle of Vienna in 1683. See also Polish Cavalry, Taurus, Taurus Pancerny, Polk-Zay, officers in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Bibliography. Reenactment. A Polish reenactment information site. Polish Hussar replica versus antique. Understand difference in Polish Hussar replica and antique. Husaria. A Los Angeles-based Polish Hussar reenactment group and reference library. 2. The first Los Angeles-based website for this portrayal. About Hussars armor. Polish. Polsko Husaria. The cavalry of the Polish Winged Hussars. Video.